Okay, hello everyone. My name is Nader Dabit. I'm a senior developer advocate at AWS working on the front-end web and mobile team. Been here for about 3 years, and I'm really excited to kind of be participating in this event and giving this workshop. So without further ado, we only have 1 hour, so let's kind of dive into what we're going to be covering today. The workshop that we're going to be working with today is called Full Stack Cloud with Next.js, Tailwind, and AWS. Now, the idea behind this workshop is because we only have 1 hour, the idea that we're going to kind of build everything in this 1 hour is probably not going to happen. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to kind of walk through how to get up and running with this project. I'm going to also walk through some of the really important fundamentals at the very beginning to kind of make sure that you're successful getting up and running. And from there, you should be able to take the knowledge that I'm sharing during this introduction to the workshop and then be able to build out the entire application on your own using the directions in the workshop documentation. Now, the workshop is structured like this. It's located on my GitHub repository. It's github.com/dabit3/Next.js Amplify workshop. Now, if you go to my GitHub repository at github.com/dabit3 and you go to repositories, it should be somewhere at the top, and the name is actually Next.js Amplify Workshop in the actual URL or the name of it. But the actual title is going to be, Full Stack Cloud with Next.js, Tailwind, and AWS. So that's how you should be able to find it. The workshop is structured in two ways. First of all, we have the example project that's already been built out, and that's in this Amplify Next folder. So if you ever get caught up having any issues when you're building everything, you can always go here and reference the code I have there. But also, the entire workshop is going to be laid out in this GitHub README. It's a pretty large workshop. We're doing quite a bit in this workshop. We're kind of covering a lot of stuff, but what we're going to be building is something pretty cool. So I think it's kind of worth it to kind of go through and understand how all of these pieces fit together. Now, when I'm working with the technology, I want to learn the things that I'm going to find the most useful to be using in the real world. Now, when you think of most types of applications, things like Facebook, Instagram, or even Twitter, there's this idea of a list view and a detail view. You also have things like authentication. You have things like authorization built in, and you also have things like file storage. So for instance, if you want to create a tweet, you have to sign in or create an account. You then have to be able to type some text, and then you might have the option to upload an image. I think a lot of applications function this way. So I think implementing all of these features in a project is extremely useful because it kind of gives you an idea of how to put all of these things together. And then you can take this knowledge and build something else, hopefully in the future. And that's what this workshop is all about. We're kind of going to be focusing all of those important fundamental features, and we're going to be building using this stack that I laid out. This is a really powerful and interesting stack. It's actually really fun to use, in my opinion. Tailwind is becoming extremely popular. Next.js is really powerful, and a lot of big companies are having a lot of success with it. And then, of course, AWS, a lot of companies are using it. You've definitely heard of companies like Netflix, Airbnb, and companies like that use AWS. So we're going to basically be tying all of that stuff together in this workshop. So what are we going to be building? We're going to be building a Next.js app where we have a few different views. We have like a home screen that lists all of the posts that we're going to be creating in our app. We're going to have the ability to create a post if we're signed in. We're going to have a profile view to view our own profile, like our information, like our username, our email address, and stuff like that, our phone number maybe. And then we're going to be able to also edit and delete our own posts. So the home screen is going to list all of the posts from all users, but our own post view is only going to be visible when we're signed in, and it's going to only query the database for the posts that we've created. And then we're also going to give the ability for the people that created their own posts to update or delete those posts. But of course, we want to make sure that this is a secure application. So we're implementing not only authentication, but we're implementing authorization and fine-grained access control for those editing and update functionality and deleting functionality. So this is kind of an idea of what some of the pages are going to look like. When you're creating a new post, it's going to look something like this. where we have a markdown editor. And there's also going to be an image upload button. Actually, that's not part of the screenshot. We're going to be able to give a title. We're going to be able to write some markdown. And then after we've created a post, we're going to be able to save it and then view the post in Markdown. We're going to be able to add images and all kinds of stuff. The profile view is going to have the user's username as well as their email address. And finally, the My Posts view, where we kind of view our own posts, is going to look something like this, where we have a list of posts and we have buttons for editing, deleting, or viewing our own post. So that's kind of it. That's kind of the introduction. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to spend the next 30 to 40 minutes walking through getting up and running with this stack. Now, to get up and running with this stack, you need to have Node.js installed on your machine, and you need to have an AWS account. From there, you should be good to go, because from there, everything else is going to kind of rely on those two things. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you take a look at the table of contents, you can kind of get an idea of how this is going to be laid out. We're going to be getting started with the initialization of the project, creating the project, creating the backend, and getting started in that way. We're going to then add an API. We're going to add authentication, and we're going to be slowly building this app up to add more and more functionality, ultimately deploying to AWS. The two main AWS, tools that we're going to be using are AWS Amplify and the serverless framework. We're going to use AWS Amplify to add all of the services that we want and use the Amplify client libraries to connect to those services. And then we're going to use the serverless framework to deploy Next.js using something called the serverless Next component, because we want to take advantage of a lot of the stuff that Next.js offers, things like server-side rendering, API routes, and fallback routes. So kind of reviewing the prerequisites, I already went over that. Node.js installed as well as an AWS account. And with that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to, like I mentioned, get started by building out the fundamental app that we're going to be building, and then I'm going to kind of let everyone take it from there. Now, the fact that this is a GitHub repository, I am asking if you have any issues, or you run into any problems, or you see any areas that can be improved, please open an issue or a pull request. Any questions that you have, feel free to open an issue. I will be happy to answer those questions there and help you out there as well. I will also be hanging around sometimes in the JS world, community discussion channels to answer questions there as well. So to get started, we're going to use npx, and we're just going to start by creating a new Next.js app. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this into my terminal. And you should be able to copy and paste pretty much everything in this workshop. I kind of made it that way to make sure that it's kind of hard to have any errors as far as code is concerned. Now, I don't recommend copying and pasting all of the code, of course. I do recommend kind of typing it out yourself, but as a fallback, you can copy and paste this. I think you learn a lot more, of course, if you type it out yourself. All right, so we're going to go ahead and change into the new directory. And we're going to go back to our documentation, our workshop materials. And we're going to go ahead and install all of the different libraries that we want to install. Now, we want to install AWS Amplify, which is the JavaScript Amplify client libraries. We're going to install the @aws-amplify/UI-react, which is a UI component library that's supported by AWS Amplify as well. This gives us an easy way to spin up an authentication flow. We have a Markdown editor that we're installing, and then we have a Markdown renderer, and then we have a UUID library that allows us to create unique identifiers on the fly. So you can use either npm, yarn, or pnpm to install this. I'm going to use yarn again. Go ahead and install that. All right. After we've installed our dependencies, we're going to now install our Tailwind dependencies. So for Tailwind to work with Next.js or with React, I guess you could say, either way, we're going to need to install these 4 dependencies. And then, well, actually, we really only need these 3 dependencies, but since we're using a Markdown editor and we're going to be kind of using a special class to style our Markdown, we're going to also add the typography plugin. So I'm just going to copy and paste these as well. Tailwind, Post CSS, and Auto Prefixture, as well as Tailwind typography. Now that we've installed our Tailwind dependencies, we're going to now initialize our Tailwind project. And this is just going to create a couple of files for us. So we're going to say npx Tailwind CSS init. And this is going to create 2 files for us. It's going to create our Tailwind config and our Post CSS config. Now, the only thing we're going to update from here is the Tailwind config, because we're going to be overriding all of the default styles and kind of removing them by using these globals here, or these imports from Tailwind. The Tailwind base, I think, or one of these just resets your CSS. And what we now want to do is add a new class that's available for Markdown. So we can add this pros class, and it automatically does stuff like H1s, H2s, paragraphs, code, and stuff like that. It automatically allows us to style that pretty easily. So what I'm going to do is I'll go ahead and open up this project in my text editor. And I'm going to go into Tailwind config. And in the plugins, in this array, I'm just going to pass in this one item. So we passed in the Tailwind CSS / typography. So I'm kind of zooming in a little bit extra to make sure that all this is visible, because I know my screen's pretty wide. Okay, so with that being said, you should be able to save that file and then get out of there, and you should be good to go. Your Tailwind should be now configured. The only thing you need to now do is add this Tailwind base components and utilities in the main globals.css. So you can open styles.globals, go ahead and copy and paste those 3 here and save those, and you should be ready to go now with Tailwind. So the next thing we want to do is we want to install the AWS Amplify CLI. There's 2 different ways to do this. You can do this either using npm or curl. If you're using an M1 Mac, you can only use the npm installation. So if you're using M1 Mac, definitely go this route, because the curl does not yet support that, based on some dependency that we use that doesn't support M1. But if you're not on an M1, I would recommend the curl installation, because it is slightly faster, or maybe 2 to 3 times faster. So that's what we're going to do on my end. I'm going to go ahead and install the Amplify CLI. Okay, so now that we've installed the Amplify CLI, we should be able to run Amplify. See that we have the CLI binary installed and get some output there. So that's good to know. The next thing we want to do is we want to configure our Amplify CLI. Now, this is something that you only have to do really once, or if you want to actually be a little bit more precise, you need to do this once for any user credentials that you want to store. For me, I use the same user almost always, so I only have really needed to do this once. But for a workshop like this, I'm going to do it again just to show you how it's done. Once you've configured your Amplify project, I wouldn't say you're configuring the project. Actually, you're actually configuring your entire environment, your computer itself. So anytime after you run this configure, you can initialize as many Amplify projects as you would like. So this is a one-time thing. And what we're basically doing is we need to create a user in our AWS account, and then we're going to kind of take those credentials and store them locally, and then we're going to reference those credentials. So the next time or anytime we create a new AWS project, we're going to be using those credentials. And it's essentially like if I logged into the console as myself and created those different services under my own name. But we want to be able to do that programmatically. So we're going to create a user with programmatic access. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to go down to our command line. We're going to run Amplify Configure. Now, this is going to walk us through a few steps. First of all, it's going to take you to the AWS Management Console and make you sign in. Now, if you are signed in, you will see a screen that looks something like this, where you kind of see that you have your account information here. You're able to toggle different regions, and you see kind of all the different AWS services. So once you're signed in, you're good to go at this step, and then you can go back to the command line. So now that I'm already signed in, I will go back to the command line. Now it's going to ask us for the region that we would like to create this user in. For me, that's US East 1 or US East 2. Depending on where you are in the world, you might choose a different region, like the Asia Pacific or the European Union or wherever you would like. So I'm going to go ahead and choose US East 1. And then we're going to give this user a name. So I kind of have a name here that I've used for this example, Amplify CLI user. You can use really whatever you would like, just something that makes sense for you to remember and understand. And this user is going to be the user name that's stored in your AWS dashboard. And then what I typically like to do is then mirror that user in just a moment locally, the user name. And that way, when we look locally at our local users, we can actually go in our dashboard and see a one-to-one mapping between those. Just makes it a lot easier to kind of understand, which user is which. So I'm going to say Amplify Next.js World Workshop. User. And I'm doing this is because later I'm going to be removing this user. If you're using this as your first user, you might want to make this a little more generic, something that you can reuse over and over, like the one I had laid out here, like the Amplify CLI user makes a lot more sense. But you can use whatever you like. So this is going to go ahead and open up the IAM Management Console. Now, what you should be able to do is follow the directions here. You should just be able to click next, 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 and then create user. So you can accept all of the defaults here. This is just going to walk you through making sure that everything looks good. But the CLI automatically sets you up with all of the right defaults. So next permissions, next tags, next review, and then create user. And then what you're going to be given now is an access key ID and a secret access key. Now, it's important that you do not close this window until you have actually taken these credentials and saved them locally. Or if you would like, you can save them in a CSV. The thing to keep in mind is these are very, very secure and important and private credentials. So to make sure you do not share these with anybody. Anyone that has these credentials can pretty much create services in your account on your behalf. So you never want to leak these anywhere. So first of all, now that we're given our access key ID and our secret access key, I'm going to now copy this access key ID to my clipboard because I'm going to need that in just a moment. So I'm going to go back to my command line, and I'm going to paste my access key ID here for this new user. And then I'm going to hit enter. And then the next thing I want to do is I also want to do the same for my secret access key. So I'm going to go here, copy it, paste it, and then hit enter. Now we have given the two credentials that are necessary for our user. And then finally, we're going to give the local profile name. So when we look locally, we're going to see this name. And then for me, this is going to map directly to the user I created in my dashboard. So I know that these users correlate with each other and they are the same user. So what I can do now is create a new project on behalf of this user. So that's what I'm going to do. And at this point, we have successfully configured our Amplify CLI, and we can go to the next step. So what I'm going to do is initialize a new Amplify project by running Amplify init. We're going to give the project a name. We'll just take Amplify next. We're going to give the environment a name. I'm going to take the default of dev. The default text editor, I use VS Code, so I'm going to choose that. Choose whatever you'd like or none. The reason that it asks this is that in the future, the CLI will often open files for you on your behalf in your text editor. It just makes it a lot easier and a lot faster if it already knows your editor. If not, it's not going to do that. So you end up having to kind of go open those files yourself. Just a little helpful part of Amplify CLI. For the type of app that we're building, we're going to choose JavaScript. For the framework we're going to be using, since we're using Next.js, we're essentially using React, but it would be nice if we had a Next.js option there. For the source directory, we're going to actually not choose src because in Next.js, there is really no root directory other than, there is no source directory other than the root directory. So to set the source directory as the root directory, I'm just going to do a dot here. And this is going to make sure that it lets the Amplify project know when it creates a file, just to create the file in the main directory. And then we're going to import those files at some point later on. Now for the distribution directory, when you run a build, it runs the build and it creates it in a .next folder. So I'm just going to do that, but I don't think this is going to really matter for us because we're going to be using the serverless Next.js component to deploy. And when you do that, it's actually going to take care of a lot of this setting up of configuration for you. For the build command, I'll just choose the default for build and start. And then at this point, we have already kind of answered all of the main questions. Now we need to set a user for this project to be created on the behalf of. So to do that, I can go ahead and choose an AWS profile. And I'm going to choose the profile that I just created, which is the Amplify Next.js World Workshop user. And then now we should be good to go. So what's going to happen now is the Amplify CLI is going to go ahead and create a new project for you, a new Amplify project. And then after this is done being created, you're going to see two new resources created locally. There's going to be a folder called Amplify. This Amplify folder will in the future hold our infrastructure as code. It will also hold things like our GraphQL schema, which we might want to update at some point as we're evolving our application. It will also hold all of our JavaScript functions or any serverless functions, regardless of the language that you create them in. It will hold all of the combination of infrastructure as code, as well as any code that we're going to be updating for our infrastructure. And then after the project has been deployed, you should be able to run Amplify status to see a local output into your CLI of the project itself. Or you can run Amplify console to actually open the project up in the actual UI. We have like a graphical user interface where you can kind of see that project. So let's go ahead and run Amplify status because it looks like our project has been successfully initialized. If I run Amplify status, I see that I have an output, which is great, but we haven't created any resources yet, so we don't have anything listed under any of these different these titles. And we can also open this up in the Amplify console by running Amplify console, and this will go ahead and open up the project here. And it looks like for some reason it didn't open up the project on the console. But if you ever need to, well, this is probably some issue with my region or something like that. But when you run Amplify console, it should open up the app in the console, and you should be able to see the details of your app here. So the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and go to creating our GraphQL API. So to do that, we're going to run Amplify add API. And we're going to kind of get started creating some services. So the service that we're going to be creating here is a GraphQL API. And when we run Amplify add API, it kind of walks us through a few steps. It asks us what type of API we want to create, because you can either create a GraphQL API or a REST API, give the API a name, you choose some authorization types and stuff like that. And we're going to kind of walk through that now. So for the API name, I'm going to call this Next Blog. For the authorization type, I'm going to choose API key for now, but the application that we're going to be building ultimately will have multiple types of authorization. Again, when you think of these types of applications that we really want to build, they have public and private access, meaning that if I am not signed in, I can typically still read a tweet. If someone's profile is open, I can typically go on Instagram and maybe see someone's picture unless they've turned their profile to private. So that's kind of considered public access. And then the private access is going to be stuff like if I have a post that I want to update or delete, I can do that. Or maybe that I have a private profile and I want to enable someone that's my friend that to actually see my profile. That all is going to be controlled by the authorization of some type of private access. So we're going to start off with public, and then we're going to move to multiple authorization types later on. So for public, it's just an API key. So that means any API request that contains the API key in the header will be able to work. For a description for the API key, I'm just going to call this public since it is public. And for the expiration, I will choose something like 365 days. You can choose whatever you'd like, but this just kind of tells you how long until the API key expires. You can always update this using the CLI and kind of keep it going and renewing it and stuff like that. For advanced settings, I'm going to go ahead and choose no for now. And next, we're going to be asked if we have a GraphQL schema. So if we already had a schema that we wanted to work with, we could reference it here. But since we don't, we're going to be kind of using this schema here. We're just going to choose no, and we're going to choose any of these templates. It doesn't really matter because we're going to be overriding it, but I guess I'll choose single object with fields. And then I do want to edit the schema. And this should automatically open up our schema in our text editor. Now, the schema should be located at the Amplify folder /backend/API folder. And then you should see the name of the API. So that's kind of how we see here, Amplify backend API, and then the name of our API, and then we have our GraphQL.schema, our schema.graphql. We're going to start off with a pretty basic type, and this type is going to evolve, over time with our app. We're going to be adding additional fields and additional directives to kind of handle the different types of authorization. So for the main items on our type, we have two main fields other than the ID. We have a title field and a content field. In the future, we're going to have also an image field. And when someone creates a post, we expect them to pass in a title and a content field. The ID can either be passed in or it can be auto-generated on the server. It's kind of up to you. So if you do not pass an ID in, then it still works, and we will just generate the ID on the server. Now, to deploy everything, we can now run Amplify Push. What's going to happen here is it's going to walk through a few steps on the initial deployment. And what it's going to set up is GraphQL code generation. So let me go ahead and bump this up. And what it's going to say, do you want to create code for your new GraphQL API? Now, when you're working with GraphQL, you have to send queries, mutations, and subscription definitions inside of the GraphQL operation. Now, if you typically build a GraphQL API from scratch, you a lot of times have to write all this code yourself. But not only Amplify, but many GraphQL tools these days will allow you to do schema introspection, meaning we're going to look inside your schema, we're going to see the different operations that need to be created, and we're going to create those for you, and then we're going to generate that code locally, and that way you don't have to write it yourself. So if you want that, which I do, I'm going to go ahead and choose yes. I'm going to choose JavaScript as the code generation target. I'm going to choose the path name here for where this code needs to be created. So we don't have an SRC folder. Instead, we're just going to create it in the root folder. So it's going to be some path like this, where we're going to say ./GraphQL, and then we're going to use the main root folder to create all of this stuff. Do I want to generate all of the operations? I'll choose yes, and then I'll take the default statement depth. So this is going to go ahead and do two things. It's going to create our API, and it's going to also create the GraphQL code locally. Now let's go ahead and jump back to our schema for a moment to kind of look at what's going to actually happen here. Now, when you create a GraphQL API, you typically have to do a few things. First of all, you have to create all of the schema that you need for the API. You have to create the resolvers for the API, and you have to create the data source. So what is very common for most applications is that you need some type of CRUD operations. So you typically need to create, read, update, delete, and then maybe list items. You also, a lot of times, want to create GraphQL subscriptions, meaning you want to subscribe to mutations. So you might want to say, okay, when someone creates a post, when someone deletes a post, or when someone updates a post, I want to subscribe to that change. And then finally, the data source itself is, of course, when you're working with any type of GraphQL operation, it has to map to some data source. So in our example, we want to have a database as well. Now, one of the things that we're using here is this @model directive. That's probably something you may not have looked at if you've never used Amplify before. And this is a Amplify specific directive, and it's part of something that we have called the GraphQL transform library. And there are 7 different directives that you can work with. Each one does its own thing. But in our example for the @model directive, what we're going to do is we're going to be able to pass in any type. And if we decorate it with this @model directives, then it's going to automatically generate all of the additional schema, first of all, that we need. So we're going to have a create, read, update, delete, and list posts schema. We're also going to have subscription definitions for all of the mutations. The next thing that it's going to do, it's going to create a DynamoDB table for posts. So that way we can save posts in this post table. And then the last thing it's going to do, it's going to create the GraphQL resolvers that map between the database and all of those operations. So all of the GraphQL operations and the database are going to be mapped together using those resolvers that we're going to create. And this kind of gives you a really great starting point for most apps. And in fact, a lot of times you don't really even have to modify this. But if you do, you can always go in and you can modify and create your own custom GraphQL resolvers, or you can create brand new GraphQL resolvers that you would like to interact with the data source. But this is a great way to kind of get up and running. And in our case, we do want to create, update, and delete posts. So it's perfect for the example that we're working with. So that being said, if we go back to our command line, we see that this is still updating. So let's now go to the next steps. So once the API has been created, we can now run Amplify Console API, and this will open up the API in our AWS console. And then we can start running GraphQL operations directly in the query editor there. So the Appsync Console is something that allows you to kind of visualize your API and play around with it. And you can actually run GraphQL operations because we have a graphical editor built in that implements all of the different authorization scenarios that you also have configured in your project. So you can toggle between public access, private access, or whatever type of access you've enabled. And you can then, for instance, simulate different users. So let's say I have private access and I've created an account for myself. I might want to simulate myself, making updates. I can then sign in as that person. So yeah, that's kind of how that works. So we go back to our CLI and everything is properly deployed. We should now see that the GraphQL operations have been successfully saved, and then all the resources have been updated in the cloud. To view those GraphQL operations, we should now go to our project, and we see that we have a GraphQL folder. This just has all of the different mutations, queries, and subscription definitions that we'll need later on. The next thing I'd mention is that we're going to test this out in the Amplify dashboard, Amplify console. So I should be able to say Amplify console API and choose GraphQL. There's something going on with our CLI today. So this should open up, and I'm not sure if there's some issue with my computer or my installation. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the AWS console and just open it myself. So I should be able to go to AWS Appsync. And I think the name of the API is Next Blog. And here I can still do the stuff that I was kind of talking about. Unfortunately, the CLI is having a hiccup today as far as like connecting to those things. So if we go to our workshop material, we should see a few different queries. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste create post. And then I'm going to go to list posts. And if I run my query, I should see that my post is coming back. And you notice that I only passed in a title and a content field, but we still had an ID. Like I mentioned, the ID is populated on the server if you don't pass it in. If you do pass it in, it will work. So we've created 2 posts. If we list posts, we see that both of the posts are coming back. Now, we can also view the table itself. If we click on data sources, we should see that we have a post table, type of DynamoDB, and a resource URL. We click on items. We click on the post itself. We see that we have all of the information for the different posts. So our database is working. Our API is working. We're kind of good to go on the API side. So the next thing we want to do is look at how we're going to wire up different AWS services with our front-end application. Amplify is a combination of a few different things. It's the CLI, which we've been using. The CLI is kind of what you use to generate, update, and delete AWS services. And then you have the client libraries, which allow you to then connect to and interact with the AWS services. That's what we're going to work on next. We haven't really used those yet. All we've done was install our client libraries. So since we have our client libraries installed, we're going to now need to go ahead and configure our project. To do so, we're going to create a new file called Configureamplify.js. And this is going to go in the root of our Next.js app. So I'm going to go ahead and create a file called Configureamplify.js. And so we have Configureamplify. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and copy these 3 lines of code. And I think I know the problem here. I think I have a white space. We're going to import Amplify from AWS Amplify. We're going to import this configuration from AWS exports. Now, where did that come from? You see right here that we actually have this file. This is a file that is automatically generated by the Amplify CLI. And you don't ever need to really edit this. This is just going to be continually updated and modified by the CLI for you. So when you create a new service, it adds the resource URIs here. When you update a service, it does the same. And when you delete a service, it removes it. And then as you continue iterating on your project, this file stays in sync. And you just don't really have to touch it, but just letting you know that it's there. And then after we've imported those 2 things, we're going to then call amplify.configure, passing in the config. And then now we can import this file wherever we would like to configure Amplify. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And I'm going to go ahead now into pages/_app.js. And after we import our globals CSS, we're going to go ahead and import configure amplify. And we're kind of good to go. So this should configure amplify on most of your pages within Next.js. The only thing that you might notice with Next.js is that if you're using an API route, the way that API routes are deployed, they might not be able to see this configuration. So you would also have to configure it there. That's why I've kind of modularized the configuration. That way you can kind of import it whenever you need it. But I think the only time we're going to need to import it is there. So now that we've configured our Amplify project, how are we going to interact with the different services like our GraphQL API? Now, if you've worked with GraphQL in the past, you might have worked with GraphQL clients like Apollo. You might have worked with Urkel. There are a bunch of them out there, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses as well. Well, when you're working with Amplify, we have a couple of different ways to interact with the GraphQL API as well. Now, you can work with Apollo or Urkel with Amplify or with Amplify/Appsync backend if you would like, but there are a lot of things that kind of go around working with authentication and authorization, like sending the proper headers with the API request that you have to deal with when you're not working with Amplify. But if you are working with the Amplify client libraries, then we automatically send all that information for you. So for instance, if you have an authenticated GraphQL API and you are signed in, we will automatically pass the access token header for you, for the user, and then authenticate for you, of course, in the service. If you're using API key authentication like we're doing today, the GraphQL client from Amplify will automatically send that API key in the header without you having to do any work. So it kind of configures and takes care of a lot of this stuff for you. That's why we're going to be using the Amplify GraphQL client. And we're going to be importing it as API from AWS Amplify like this. And with the API client or the Amplify library, you can use either REST APIs or GraphQL APIs. So if you're working with GraphQL API, you call API.GraphQL. If you're working with a REST API, you will call API.RESTverb. So it might be API.get, API.post, API.put, so on and so forth. So with that being said, just wanted to kind of give you an overview of the API library. This is kind of what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and update index.js with this code here. So let's walk through what's going on. First of all, when we're fetching data and we want to render it to the screen in React, we have to store it in our state somewhere. So in our case, we're going to be working with an array of posts. So if we go to queries and we run list posts again, we see that our data comes back and it looks something like this. We have a data object, we have a list post object as well, and then we have an items array. And then if you keep on scrolling down, we can even return a next token, and this is for pagination. But in our case, we don't have any paginated items because we only have 2 items, right? So next token is not going to be something we're interested in. What we are interested in is this items array. So we want to be able to kind of pull that items array down and then map over that. So what we're going to do is we're going to first create a initial state of an empty array and set that to the post variable. We're going to create a function using useState again. That's going to be able to give us the opportunity to update that array called setPosts. And then we're going to create a function called fetchPosts that will call the GraphQL API. And here we're going to call API.GraphQL. And the only thing we need to pass in as far as arguments are concerned is a query variable for the query that the GraphQL operation that we'd like to run. So in this case, the operation is list posts. So we're calling API.GraphQL, passing in the list post query. And then we call setPosts, passing in the list posts.items array. So if we kind of go back again here, we see that we have data.listPost.items. That's exactly what we're kind of saying here. We have a variable, and then we're saying data list post items. This is the items array. And then in our main UI, we're going to map over the posts, and we're going to say post.map. And for every item in the post array, we're going to return a div that is going to just have the post title. Now we're also working with Tailwind, so we're going to see that we start using some of that Tailwind here. For the class name, we're going to say text to 3XL, which is going to be, of course, large text. We want the text to be semi-bold. We have our tracking set. We have margin top of 6 and margin bottom of 2. And it's, I'm not going to walk through all the Tailwind stuff, but for instance, one other thing, since we're working with a link, we want the cursor to be a pointer so we can kind of hover over it and it looks like a link. We have a border bottom of 1 pixel. We have the border color set to gray. And then I'm not sure why I have the space here. I need to fix that. But we also have a margin top of 8 and a padding bottom of 4. This is just to kind of like, style the array the way that we'd like it to look. So I'm just going to copy all of this. I'm going to go into pages/index.js. I'm going to paste that here. Okay, so that all looks good. Now, the next thing we want to do is go ahead and test this out. So to do that, I'm going to run npm run dev. And we'll see if our app works. So we should see that our app is started on localhost 3000. Go ahead and visit localhost 3000 and zoom in a little bit. All right. So what we see is we actually have our post array rendered to our screen like we want. And if we hover over one of the posts, we zoom in a little bit or a lot bit, we see that we have our cursor set to a pointer, which is kind of what we expected. And we have our pretty basic title. Now, this isn't very pretty yet, so we have a lot of work to do as far as styling is concerned, but it's a start because we now are updating or we're now fetching data from our API, which is a good start. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add some navigation, and we're going to also add a new route, and we're going to add authentication, and we're going to kind of do all of that next. So the first thing we want to do to actually add authentication is first add the service itself. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my command line, and I'm going to run amplify add auth. It's going to walk us through a few steps. With authentication, you can either walk through all of the different options and kind of configure the entire setup yourself, or you can choose a default configuration, which kind of gives you out of the box the ability to sign up a user with username, email address, and password, and then the optional phone number. So in our case, since we're doing a workshop, we want to kind of get up and running quickly with some pretty good defaults. That's what we're going to use. We're going to go with the default configuration. The next thing we want to choose, do we want to allow users to sign up with a username or email address or phone number? We're just going to choose username. And then if we want advanced settings, we could choose yes, but we don't. So I'm going to choose no. And then all we need to do to deploy is run Amplify Push. Now here's the tip. You can also run Amplify Push --y, which will automatically answer yes to the question of, are you sure you want to deploy? Because it usually will ask that if there's a change, or it should always ask that. It will say, are you sure you want to make these changes? If you're pretty confident about the changes that you're about to make, then you can choose yes. So this is going to go ahead and deploy. And I think what we can now do, since this is going to take a couple of minutes, is we can start working on some of our client-side code. So what we want to do is we want to create a profile view for users. So we want to be able to allow them to visit this page. If they're not signed in, we want to force them to create an account and sign in, or just ask them to, I guess you would say. And then if they are signed in, we want to show their username and their email address, and then give them the ability to sign out. And that's what we're doing. And here you see we have, I don't know how many lines of code, maybe 25 or so. And with this little amount of code, we're able to spin up an entire authentication flow and a profile view, which is pretty nice. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import the with authenticator component and the Amplify sign out component from the UI library. The with authenticator is what allows us to spin up this authentication flow in front of any component. And then the sign out button is just a pre-styled sign out button that allows us to kind of get up and running really quickly with that. We also import the auth class from AWS Amplify. Before, we were using the API class for interacting with GraphQL and REST APIs. In this example, or in this case, we're using the auth class, which is a different class that we haven't really worked with. We're, of course, using useState and useEffect from React to work with local state like we did before. We have a very similar flow as we did earlier, where we create some local state. We have a useEffect hook that triggers or invokes a function. And then we have our function call that updates the local state. In the check user function, we're going to be calling auth.currentAuthenticated_user. Auth.currentAuthenticated_user is a way to check for the signed in user or lack thereof. If there is a signed in user, this will return a user object that we can then use to get information about that user. So we might want to get their email address. We might want to get their other attributes. We're going to do that using this function here, and then saving that user in the state. And then we're going to check to see if there is no user. And if not, we're going to return null. This is just going to be an instant, though, because immediately this is going to be updated and there will be a user. And then we're going to return this UI where we have the title, and then we have the username and the email address and the sign out button. Now, to make this work, we just wrap the component that we'd like to authenticate in this with authenticator. And that's about it. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we're going to go back to our code. And I'm going to create a new file called profile.js. Pages directory, by the way. And paste all of that code here. We see that we have exactly what we have from the workshop. The next thing we want to do, though, is by default, the Amplify UI components come styled with the Amplify color of like a yellowish, orangish color. But in our example, we want to have a blue theme. So we're going to be using colors from Tailwind that match the color that we're about to use for our UI component library. Now, to style all of the different UI components, we can kind of set some primary colors. And to do that, we can open styles.globals.css and just paste in this Amplify primary color, Amplify primary tint, and Amplify primary shade on the root. To do that, I'll just go ahead and copy that. go into globals, and then right below our Tailwind stuff, I'm just going to paste these in. Now, this could be whatever you like. So if you want to change this to like whatever color you would want, you just have to remember when you're doing your Tailwind stuff in just a moment, you're going to change the blue to whatever color you're working with. So I'll save that. And then finally, what we want to do is we want to update our main app component to have some navigation. Now, if we go back to what this looks like, we're just rendering our posts. We don't have any padding. We don't have any styling at all. We also don't have any navigation. But we do want all that stuff. So we're going to go ahead and update. And right now, all we're doing, if we go to underscore app.js, go ahead and close these other files that we're not using. So in underscore app.js, we're only returning the component. But what we want to do is we want to have a navigation that has a few different links. We have 3 links, actually. The first link just links back to the root, which is kind of the home directory or the home page. We then are going to create a new page that we're going to create a new link to a page that we haven't yet created called Create Post. Create Post is going to allow users to create a new post in the form that we're going to be creating in just a moment as well. And then finally, we're going to give users the ability to link to the profile page, which is the page that we just created. And then finally, we're going to add our main component, and we're going to give some styling that kind of wraps our main component. So we're going to have our navigation, and then we're going to have all of the stuff rendered below that. And all of the stuff rendered below that is going to have padding for pretty much anything below the nav. So padding Y of 8, so padding top and bottom of 8, padding X, which is padding left and right of 16 REM. I believe it's REM. So I can now copy this, and I'm going to go back to app.js and paste that there. And another thing that we're importing that we haven't talked about is this link component. So to link anything, and I think we used this earlier as well, you need to import the link from next link, and then you pass in an href to link. And actually, you know what? Something I don't have here is I believe you need to have an anchor tag. So I would, I might be updating this workshop to include this, but this isn't going to be anything that's going to throw an error or a warning or anything. But I think best practices say that there should be an anchor tag within the links for Next.js. Okay, so no big deal if you don't do that, but I'll go ahead and do that. So what we're going to do now is test this out. So I can run npm run dev. And we'll go back to localhost 3000 and see what our app looks like now. All right. What we have here now that we see, we have a little bit better styling. We still have some work to do, but we're getting a little bit better. We have our posts, and we have a little bit of padding around the posts. We also have the ability to link and view other pages like our profile. So if we click on profile, we see that we have our UI to sign in and sign up. We can kind of go back and forth. If we click on create post, it's going to throw an error because we don't have that page created yet. So let's go ahead and create an account and see if our profile is working. All right, so we're signed in. We should be able to refresh and see that we stay signed in as well, which is good. So we've now implemented an API. We've implemented our authentication, and we should be able to sign out and then sign back in. All right. So our profile is working. Our API is working. the next thing that we're going to be working on is improving and kind of going to the next steps with this app. Now that ends the introduction to the workshop. From here, you should be able to kind of have all of the different things under the hood that you need to know and understand to kind of be successful for the rest of this stuff. So we've covered like the bread and butter, the main stuff. From here, you're going to be continuing to update, iterate, and improve this app to get to the point where you have more functionality, you have that authorization, you have the ability to upload images, cover images, working with S3, having multiple authorization types like we're going to be doing here. So yeah, I think that's it as far as this part is concerned. Like I mentioned, if you have any issues or any questions, feel free to open up an issue within the GitHub repo, and I'll be keeping an eye on it and trying to help out. And if you have any other questions, you can also follow me on Twitter. I'm Dabit3. Reach out to me. I'd be happy to help. And that's it for me. So thank you for having me here, and thank you for attending my workshop. I hope you learned a lot, and I will be looking forward to seeing everyone around for the rest of the conference. Thank you.